Flash is used a lot for creating interactive applications, including business applications, but we especially find Flash used in the education environment for creating computer-based training, as well as in the entertainment industry. Most of your online games, at least traditionally, have been created with Adobe Flash. That's changing a little bit, and HTML, CSS3, and JavaScript are changing that landscape. But Flash is still very popular for creating games, and we can create games for iPad, iPhone, Android devices with Adobe Air, which, if you continue on learning about Flash, we offer 3 courses here at South Mountain. You're in the beginning class, which focuses on drawing and animation with a little bit of programming, which we're going to get into today. The second class really focuses heavily on programming, and then the third class focuses on creating applications for iPad, iPhone, and Android with the additional product of Adobe Air. So I have here an animation running in Adobe Flash. This was created with Flash, and we've already looked at movie clips. Buttons are the primary vehicle for interactivity, and I've created 2 buttons here. If I point at one of the buttons, such as pause, it turns purple. Hold the mouse button down, it's going to turn yellow, and if I let the mouse button up, it's going to pause our animation. So it triggers an event when I click on it to cause something to happen. In this case, it's pausing the animation. I've got a resume button. Same thing, if I point to it, it turns purple. Mouse button down, turns yellow. Let go of it, and it's going to resume my animation. Click pause, click resume. So what we're going to look at in this video is how do we create these buttons, and then how do we program them to pause and resume the animation. So I have here my animation already pre-built, and over 3 seconds, there's 24 frames per second. Over 3 seconds or 72 frames, the animation here goes around. So if I just run this movie, you can see the animation moving. What I want to do now is add those buttons for pausing and resuming. And I'm going to take my text tool, and I'm just going to type the word resume, and I'm going to start with that being black so I can see it. And then I'm going to take a rectangle tool, get my fill color. I'm going to start with a dark red, and I'm going to draw a rectangle around the word resume. Now, there's all kinds of ways that we can create buttons. This is just a simple, nice little rectangular button. Let me go ahead and change that text to white. And so I've got my text box and my rectangle. What I want to do is select both of those together. I'm going to right click and choose Convert to Symbol. Now, we've used movie clips in the past, and now we're going to create a symbol that is a button. So my type is going to be button, and I like to begin my buttons with the names, with the letters BTN for button, and give it some meaningful name. So it's going to be BTN Resume. Now, when I created my button, I created it on my animation layer, and it broke my classic tween. So I'm going to select my button and cut it. I'm going to lock my tween layer and go to layer 2, and on layer 2 is where I want to paste this. Again, I'll just move it into place. Now, like movie clips, buttons have timelines, but they're unique. I'm going to double click on my button to burrow down into it and look at the timeline. Rather than having numbers 1 through whatever for our timeline, a button really has 4 frames. The first frame is what the button looks like in the up state. That's when nothing's happening to it, I'm not pointing to it. In the over state is what I want the button to look like when I point to it. The down state is what the button looks like when I hold the mouse button down on it. And the hit state, or the hit frame, is the area of the button that is going to interact with the user. Now, in the case of a rectangular button, it's going to basically be the same size as this rectangle. But let's add an overstate here. I'm going to right click on the overstate and choose Insert Keyframe. And all I'm going to do is select the fill of my rectangle. I'm going to make it purple. Then on the down state, I'm going to insert a keyframe. Again, select the fill. I'm going to make this one yellow. Now I kind of lose the white text, so I'm going to select the text and make it black. And then the hit state is going to be basically whatever this rectangle area is. If I just simply add a frame here, it's going to duplicate or extend the down frame into the hit frame, and the area that's going to interact with the mouse is the entire button itself. If I made this into a blank keyframe, I could say the interaction with the button is only going to be this area, or maybe it's going to be this area. I can define the area that interacts with the user, or where the mouse interaction is going to take place, based on the contents of this hit frame. Now I don't want that. I'm going to undo that and go back to my regular frame, and so it's the same size as my rectangle. Now I'm going to go back to scene 1. Let me just test this for a minute. And so when I point to the button, it turns purple. Hold the mouse button down, it turns yellow, and the text becomes black. And nothing happens when I let go of the mouse, or nothing happens when I click on it, because the next step is to write some code that will cause something to happen when I click on this button. But you can see the different states as we've defined them in the timeline of that button. So up, over, down, hit are our 4 frames. Now I want to have another button, which is going to be the pause button, and I could create it the same way, but here's a little shortcut. I want it to be basically the same size as this. So I'm going to go into my library. I'm going to right click on the resume button. I'm going to duplicate that. Let's call this one BTN pause. And I'm going to double click on it to go into the timeline for it. And I'm now in the editor for my symbol, so I don't see the rest of the stage. So in the up state, what I need to do is change the word resume to pause. Need to do the same thing here in the overstate and in the down state. I'm not changing any colors or anything else, and that's the extent of the changes I need to make to the button. And now I need to bring a copy of it from the library onto my stage. And again, if I test, we'll see it interacts with the user in terms of changing colors, but again, nothing happens. So now we need to look at how to add the interactivity that will pause and resume our animation. We're going to write some code, and the language we're using is called ActionScript. And in ActionScript, if I'm going to use an object such as these buttons, and I want to write code for those, I need to give these names. And we do that in the properties. So I'm going to click on the pause button, and in the properties, I need to give this an instance name. I'm going to call this pause underscore BTN. And I could have named this Fred or Sally. There's a couple rules that I must follow. That is, they can only be one word, no spaces, but I can't use underscores. And I can use numbers, but I can't start with a number. Typically, names are lowercase, and we can make these camel casing. So I could do something like pause animation as my name. Camel casing is where we're capitalizing each subsequent word, but we start with a lowercase letter. And again, I always like to name my buttons with an underscore BTN. That just tells me in code that this is a button, and depending on how your computer is set up, you can get some Intellisense, because the ActionScript editor will recognize this name as a button name because of that underscore BTN. So I'm going to go back and just change this a little more simply to pause underscore BTN. Let's rename our resume button resume underscore BTN. And then we need to write some code to tell Flash what we want to have happen when we click on these two buttons. To do that, I'm going to add another layer in my timeline. I'm going to name this layer Actions. I'm going to lock the layer, and I'm going to move it up to the top. Now I like to have my actions layer always at the very top of my application. The only thing that goes above it is I might have a layer called labels, and we'll look at that in a future video. So I have a keyframe here on the actions layer. I can't draw anything on it because I've locked it, but I can access the actions. I'm going to right click on that keyframe and choose actions, and that brings up what's called the actions editor. Over here on the left hand side is a help system for the different classes, and I can burrow down in and look at information in terms of events, methods, and properties for objects. Below that, I can see the actions that I have built. Right now I only have one action here, and that's for frame 1. In ActionScript 3, our actions primarily reside in frames on the timeline. Over here on the right hand side is where I write my code. Now let's talk about how to code a button. I've given my object some name, my button a name. And then my first line is going to be whatever name I've given it, a period, or what we usually refer to as a dot. Object name dot. And then I've got a keyword here called add event listener. Add event listener has to be typed in exactly this way, all lowercase with a capital E and a capital L. Then in a set of parentheses, I'm going to specify an event class, dot an event type, a comma, and I'm going to come up with some function name. Now I get to decide the object name and the function name, but the object name needs to be whatever I named it in the properties, and the function name kind of follows the same rules, except I uppercase the first letter, capitalize the first letter. You don't have to, but that's a pretty good standard. And again, if no spaces, but if you want to have multiple words here, you can use camel casing and capitalize each subsequent word. And then closing paren and a semicolon. A semicolon tells Flash this is the end of the statement. So I've created this function name. Now I need to define that as a function. So I'm going to create some more code here. The word function, whatever the function name was that I chose, has to be the same here as it was here, and cased exactly the same. And inside parentheses, some variable. I usually just use the letter E. The event class that I specified up here, and for buttons we're going to use mouse event, closing paren, a colon, and a return type. And our return type, at least for now, is going to always be void. Then I've got a curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. And then in the line between is where I add the code that I want to have whatever happen. So here's the example. For our pause button, our first line of code is going to be pause underscore btn, that was the name of our button, dot add event listener. Inside parentheses, I'm going to use the mouse event class, and it has an event type of click. That means that I'm going to listen for a click on this button, and when that happens, I'm going to call or execute this function called pause animation. That was a name that I chose. So the things that are in black are things that I was able to choose. The things that are in blue are keywords that Flash understands, and if they're italicized, they're referring to a general keyword that has to be specified. So an event class has to be more specified as mouse event. The event type has to be specified as .click. Now there are other types of mouse events that we can do on buttons, such as roll over and roll out. If I just want to point to a button and have it do something. And I can also create an event where I roll out and have it do something else. So we have a function named pause animation, closing paren, semicolon. Here's my function. So the keyword function, same name that I gave it in that previous statement, pause animation. In parentheses, I used a variable which is called E. You'll also see EVT used by a lot of programmers. A colon, and then the type of event class, mouse event, was what I specified up here. I don't want the .click, I just want the event class, not the event type. Closing paren, colon, my return type is void. I've got my two curly brackets, opening and closing. And here's what I want to have it do. When I click this button, I'm simply going to issue a command called stop with a set of parentheses. This is called a method. We can recognize methods by parentheses and a semicolon. Let's go ahead and actually code this in Flash. going to go back to my actions editor, pause underscore btn dot add event listener, and if I type it in correctly, it'll show up in blue. If it doesn't turn blue, check to make sure that you gave it the correct case in terms of all lowercase with a capital E and a capital L. So for example, if I didn't make this a capital E, it doesn't turn blue. My parenthesis, I'm going to specify the mouse event class. I'm going to type a dot and specify my event as click, a comma, and then the name of my function. We decided to call this pause animation. Closing paren, semicolon. Then I'm going to write my function. Function, pause animation. My variable is E, the colon, mouse event, colon, void, my curly brackets. And if I type 1, it's going to add the second one for me and give me my cursor indented in the line in between. And my command here was stop, set of parentheses, and a semicolon. Now there's a little blue check mark here. I can click that to check the syntax and see if I got an error. If I did have an error, we would see the compiler error window come up and would give us the name of our error or multiple errors. So I didn't get an error, so it seems like everything's going to work okay. That's not always the case. Sometimes we have what's called runtime errors. But let me now just test this movie. So there's my animation going around. I come over and click the pause button, and the animation stops. Now we haven't programmed our resume button yet, so that's the next step. So let's go back into our actions, and we had our button resume underscore btn. Now I can type that after all this, or I can put it up here. I like to put all of my event listeners together, so I'm going to add it up here underneath pause underscore btn. We'll do resume underscore btn, add event listener, mouse event dot click, and click has to be all uppercase, and we'll just call this one resume animation. Okay, so I'm going to come down below my function for pause animation, write function resume animation e colon mouse event, closing paren, colon, void, my curly brackets, and my command here is simply play. So this stops the animation, this plays the animation. Check my syntax. I didn't get any errors. Let's test. Pause, resume, pause, resume. Now if I click resume again while it's playing, nothing's going to happen. It's already playing. And if I pause and click pause again, nothing happens because it's already stopped. So that is a very brief look at creating buttons and coding those buttons in ActionScript to actually do something, in this case stopping and playing the animation.